Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Joan Gans Cuny and Peter G. Peterson Fund, Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Malkin Fund, the May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, the Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America. I'm Richard Heffner, your host on The Open Mind, and my focus today on an absolutely brilliant, totally mesmerizing new book about the age of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, Fear Itself, the New Deal and the Origins of Our Time, is admittedly a reflection both of my own childhood devotion to FDR and of my first presidential vote for Harry Truman. It reflects, too, the wisdom of the author's insight that, quote, those who rail at the preponderance of lobbyists in Washington today or the uneven impact of organization and money in American politics must examine the 1930s and 1940s to understand their origins. The author of Fear Itself and my guest today is Ira Katznelson, Ruggles Professor of Political Science and History at Columbia University. He is also president of the Social Science Research Council. And today I would first ask Professor Katznelson what he thinks of Nick Lemon's recent New York Review of Books comment about Fear Itself, titled not so incidentally, The New Deal We Didn't Know, comment that my guest, quote, thinks like a political scientist, although he defines the period presidentially as the 20 years Roosevelt and Truman were in the White House. They are spectral presences, not the primary determiners of the course of government, and the author has no interest in their personal qualities or their methods of leadership. Instead, his focus is on Congress and government agencies, and more broadly on political systems, voting, and interest groups. And I would ask you, is that a fair evaluation?
Well, Nick Lemon is a very astute reader and observer, and I found his review to be uncommonly thoughtful and critical at moments as well. I think of myself as someone trained in history who's taught most of his life as a political scientist at the junction of these two disciplines. I say early in the book, it's not quite traditional history, nor is it quite traditional political science. What Nick got right was the central focus of the book is not on the President of the United States. It's not a presidential history about Roosevelt and Truman. It is about the central institution of constitutional government, the legislature, where lawmaking takes place. And at that time, so many people, friends and enemies of democracy alike, thought constitutional democracies and their legislatures could not solve big problems. And the New Deal, my gosh, was confronted with some of the biggest problems this country and the world ever had to face. So I focused on the legislature and on problem solving.
And you seem to be very contemporary in doing that. Aren't we back again?
Today, the rhetoric, the discussion, and the situation about Congress in the United States is more like that of the interwar period of the last century than any time in between. We're worried, once again, about the capacity of liberal, democratic, constitutional government to identify and solve big problems. But we might remember we did it then, and I believe we could do it once more.
We did it before, and we can do it again.
Yes, I
Going
think so.
back to the wartime, but I wonder why you feel yourself that in a tripartite government, why do you yourself embrace the legislature as the most significant one?
You know, the first great scholar and theorist of a good regime to place his bets on the legislature was John Locke, who says in the second treatise in the late 17th century that the legislature is the central institution of a good polity because it's there that the people and the state get connected. Our representatives are people chosen to represent the preferences of citizens, and in turn, with government made permeable, legislators act to reshape the world in which citizens live. It is the location of the give and take between citizens and government. When it works, constitutional democracy is effective. When it doesn't work, the whole system is in deep trouble.
What makes it not work when it does not work?
Well, the critics, even back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, offered an analysis much like that we hear today. What's wrong with legislatures, democratic legislatures? They're polarized. They're divided between very different ideological positions. Money talks. Elections are shaped often, and the outcome of elections shaped by who donates and how much they donate to elections. The legislature is often criticized for not having a coherent and effective sense of public or civic purpose. Constituents and constituencies looking out for their own. Those were the criticisms made not only by the friends of democracy in the 20s, 30s, and 40s of the last century, but by the enemies of democracy as well. On the eve of Roosevelt's first inauguration, Mussolini made a speech in which he said, "Today, all experiments are anti-liberal. All political experiments are anti-liberal." And by that he meant anti-liberal in the sense that they were, the experiments were taking place in regimes that did not have legislatures at their heart. And when dictators came to power, Mussolini in 1922, Hitler in 1933, one of their first acts was to end the capacity of legislatures to make laws and passed on that authority to the executive branch. And that, I think, is the great divide between dictatorship and democracy. The end of representation and the dictatorships in a pluralistic, competitive, often adversarial, messy manner, as opposed to an attempt to impose a singular public interest determined by the dictatorial party.
And yet, I'm so taken by fear itself, in which you begin with careful notation of the degree to which FDR paid his respects to Mussolini, to the fascist state, to the emphasis upon leadership. But you do that, and then you say there was still something else.
Yes, a lot else, actually.
A lot else, but most importantly, it seems to me, concessions to or dealings with the Congress, the legislature, which was dominated by racist Democrats from the South.
Now, on the eve of the inauguration, the month before, in February 1933, Walter Lippmann, the most important columnist in the country, wrote 7 columns in the Herald Tribune in which he counseled President Roosevelt that it would be necessary to suspend Congress if the emergency of the collapse of the economy were to be addressed. And the last few paragraphs of the great inaugural speech, the one in which the president told us we had nothing to fear but fear itself, the end of that speech, the president said, "I will ask the Congress to do A, B, and C, and if they do not, I will ask for the one remaining capacity that I will need, the right to rule by executive power." But he never did that. The country never had that happen. Executive capacity grew, but it did not bypass Congress. Even the 100 Days, the great legislative torrent that set the country on a new path in the first period of the Roosevelt presidency, occurred in the Congress, and the Congress often inserted items in that legislation the president himself did not want. We never lost that centrality of the legislature, but ironies on top of ironies involved in the story. As you note, the Democratic Party was a strange bedfellows institution. Northern liberals like Robert Wagner of New York, Southern racists like Theodore Bilbo of Mississippi. And after 1938, a majority of Democrats in Congress were from the 17 states in the Union that practiced mandatory racial segregation. So one of the questions I placed front and center in the book was, well, what difference did that make? We kept legislative government. We kept lawmaking. We kept democracy. But we did so in a Faustian bargain that linked modern American democracy and its remaking to the least liberal, least democratic part of the American polity.
Because of legislature, shall I call it supremacy, or because in your own thinking, we happily enough did not find Franklin Roosevelt executing or calling upon those final supreme presidential powers?
It's such a complex matter and fascinating. Lawmaking occurs through a complex process in the legislature. The masters of that process were Southern Democrats. Why? They came from a one-party system. They didn't have opposition. They had great seniority. They had massive experience. They often occupied the central leadership posts. The president, in going to Congress, in submitting legislation to Congress, in not doing what Lippmann had proposed, suspending Congress, had no choice but to work within the legislature in a manner as dictated by the leaders of congressional committees, the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader, and the full complement of Southerners in the House and the Senate who truly dominated the institution. And in consequence, nothing could pass into law against their opposition in the 1930s and 1940s. And after 38, when they constituted a majority of the party, I go so far as to claim that everything that passed into law mapped almost precisely onto the preferences of the American South. But these white Southern representatives were not conservatives in the sense of today's conservatives. They came from a dirt poor region. They liked the New Deal. Bilbo, the leading racist in the Senate, campaigned as a 100% New Dealer. But all that depended on keeping race off the national agenda and of making sure that the South maintained its autonomy in matters of race.
You make certain that the reader knows that FDR was aware of this.
Yes.
And that FDR was aware of what you call the Faustian bargain. And that even in the matter of an anti-lynching bill, he would not speak up for it because of what that would have done to his support in the South.
I think that's quite correct. President Roosevelt, unlike his wife, was, one might say, indifferent to these questions. He wasn't
indifferent?
Indifferent. He wasn't a racist, although he spent a lot of time in the South, but indifferent in the sense that it wasn't high on his priorities to crusade to try to change the racial order.
But now, wait a minute. What I get from reading your book is that he had no option. If he were to be successful in his New Deal legislation, and then most importantly, later in his war activities, he was going to had no choice but to go along with the South.
No, that's quite right. Your reading is an accurate reading of the book. He had no choice, but sometimes we find ourselves in circumstances of no choice and we deeply regret and resent not having had the choice. In the case of President Roosevelt, I don't think he saw it quite that way. Eleanor did, but not Franklin.
Why do you say that?
The well,
You take no pleasure in saying that.
no, I
trust.
take absolutely no pleasure. I think in that manner, I don't even mean it. Of course, it's retrospectively a critical comment, but it's a critical comment on the much wider milieu of American politics and society at that moment. I think it was true that the majority, great majority of northern, non-southern political actors in Congress, in the executive branch, and elsewhere, not all, but almost all, took the Southern system as if a fact of nature. It's the way it was. Even a Republican president, William Howard Taft, in 1909, in the midst of one of the most boring inaugural addresses in American history, spoke in the middle paragraphs that leap off the page when one reads it to explain how it's no longer the business of the federal government to be concerned with Southern race relations. This matter is now settled. And he spoke at just the moment when the Southern states had completed their legal regime that came to be called Jim Crow. And Franklin Roosevelt grew up within that world. Both major parties at the time thought that race was not legitimately on the agenda of the federal government.
You know, as someone who grew up then, and I concede that FDR was my hero,
And mine.
well, you're a lot younger. I lived through Bilbo. He was very real to me and
Yes.
to the other racists. I find it very difficult to really to wrap myself around your description of FDR.
I think FDR was appalled, as many Southerners were appalled, by the Bilbos, who were the rhetorical racists, who spoke of mongrelization, who not only spoke in the most despicable terms about African Americans, but about Jews and other minorities. They were shameless in their speech. Many Southerners, most Southern representatives in Congress, were appalled and ashamed at that level of speech. But as one, the Southern members of Congress, including the most liberal, like one of my heroes, Claude Pepper of Florida, never, not once, spoke against segregation. Indeed, in 1948, when President Truman so courageously desegregated the military, Pepper spoke to his constituents and said, don't misunderstand, the President of the United States is not in favor of ending segregation in daily life in the South. So this was the normal character of speech and expectations in American life. And one could really find very, very few political leaders who were sufficiently angered and appalled to lead any kind of effort or crusade against it.
Tell me, it must occur to many people reading Fear Itself, there is some connection that you might draw between FDR and the Southern Democrats and his relations with them, and President Obama and the Tea Party and present Republicans.
Well, analogies are tricky across time.
Okay, fair enough.
You began by asking about a description of whether I think like a political scientist, and now I want to assert I'm thinking like a historian, and thinking about differences and similarities, but also the differences. The Tea Party would not exist if not for the most radical change in recent American politics, the shift of the South from Democratic to Republican. But in that shift, there was a movement away from a majority of Southern members of Congress and political leaders being, in some sense, liberals. Liberals in terms of social and economic policy, pro-Social Security. Southerners voted for the Wagner Act. Southerners voted for the National Industrial Recovery Act, for a stronger and larger federal government, for more taxes and redistribution. The South was dirt poor. They were not conservatives in the same sense that an anti-government Tea Party is, with one big exception. By the 1940s, the Southern members of Congress had figured out that if a national labor movement grew strong, the racial order of the South might collapse. And the moment the Southerners departed from the consensus of the Democratic Party was the moment they realized that they must act with Republicans to limit the capacities of organized labor. And the key moment of that came in 1947 with the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act, two Republicans writing that act with nearly unanimous Southern Democratic support against the veto, overturning the veto of President Truman. And that's the moment where a kind of Tea Party shift begins to occur. But today, of course, President Obama faces not a circumstance of members of his own party resisting some features of his politics, but the other party in a system of divided government. Whereas with the exception of 2 years, in the 20-year period of Roosevelt and Truman, there were significant Democratic Party majorities. But then, in effect, we had a three-party system.
Indeed.
Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, and Republicans. And the outcome in issue after issue, including matters of foreign policy and war and peace, often to the good as well as not just to the bad, depended on the decisions taken by the segregationist wing of the Democratic Party.
And today, what do you see? I mean, hell of a question.
Yes.
But as a political scientist,
Yes.
what do you see happening now, given your enormous respect and calling from the wings John Locke in terms of legislative government? What do you see happening?
I think some lessons have been learned in the immediate recent past. We just had a shutdown in the fall. We're not going to have another shutdown.
Prediction?
Prediction.
Okay.
There's now an agreement. We will not have a shutdown. Of course, I could be proved wrong. When members of Congress, most members of Congress, learn and see and feel that the American people are no longer suspending their disbelief about politicians. Indeed, they come to the view that Congress isn't doing the public's job. Whether or not they're conservatives or liberals, most Americans have come to that view. Members of Congress look at that and they think, wait, we perhaps might just pause before we jump over the cliff entirely. So a prediction, a moderately optimistic one, very moderately optimistic, gingerly put, without as much confidence as I would like, is that we will, over the next year or two, develop the capacity at least to keep government going in a manner that is decent. What we will not see in this era of highly polarized, divided government is more gain in an ambitious direction for the creative use of the public realm to build a more decent society. I think that will have to wait until, once again, there will be majorities for such policies, both in the White House and in Congress.
We have just a couple of minutes left. You make reference to the role of money.
Yes.
Now, aren't you, another hell of a question, don't you feel that given the stamp of approval by the Supreme Court upon the use of money, almost unlimited, that we have no opportunity now to go back to a time when the legislature could play a positive role, not just a powerful role?
In the age of Roosevelt, there were no restrictions on campaign finance, and there was no serious labor movement at the beginning. There was a lot of money sloshing around politics. I think Citizens United decision was terrible. Terrible for democracy. It twists our democracy out of shape by allowing this gush of unlimited money into the system. Don't get me wrong, but I do think that what we learned from the two Obama campaigns is that it's possible to mobilize counter monies. Both political parties can find access to funds so as to have a genuine public debate. The system is, I believe, biased given the amounts of money and who has the most money in the system. But it's not a closed system entirely.
So you think it's a matter of debate, not a matter of buying?
I think it's a combination, alas, of both. You can't debate unless you can find the space, the TV time, the media
Fair
for the
enough.
attention. But once you reach a certain threshold, the debate can take place. And I believe that with a debate taking place, a genuine debate, an open debate, the outcome might once again move us in a direction of a more just and more democratic society.
You mean that when there is an open encounter, a free and open encounter, truth will prevail?
Not all the time, but much of the time.
But you do seem to be optimistic along those terms.
I am moderately optimistic. I think that we have to confront the sources of our anxieties about democracy. Issues to do with the nature of citizen influence and capacity of people to influence the political realm and the unevenness of which you've spoken. I think we need to focus on the capacities of government, including the legislature, to take up again its role of creative lawmaking. And we need to think hard about which issues in the public realm most need attention of thoughtful government.
Certainly, Professor Katznelson will do it if enough people read Fear itself. It's a magnificent book.
Thank you.
Thank you for writing it, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
And thanks too to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time. Meanwhile, as an old friend used to say, good night and good luck. And do visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to reprise this program online right now, or to draw upon our archive of 1,500 or so other Open Mind and related programs. That's 13.org/openmind. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Joan Gans Cuny and Peter G. Peterson Fund, Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Malkin Fund, the May and Samuel Rudin Family Foundation, the Joanne and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.